So here we go. March 28th, 2025. Trump calls the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History divisive, race-centered, and corrosive. He threatens its funding. He wants the museum to redefine the narratives it presents, and he wants to install board members who share his vision of what he calls a more traditional view of American heritage. Did your heart stop when you heard that news? Did your stomach turn over? Did heat go to the top of your head and your hair stood on end and maybe even went on fire? That's how I felt. But now I'm asking myself, what does that have to do with coming to the table with Linked Descendants? Okay, so I had all this reaction, but so what? Well, big so what? Back in 2006, when we set up Coming to the Table, we developed these four, we called them at that time pillars, now the four approaches. And two of them bring us directly into being concerned with protecting our precious history. First of all, one of the pillars for Coming to the Table is uncovering history, researching, acknowledging, sharing history at all levels, personal, family, state, and national, and histories related to race, to inequality, injustice, and oppression, and being absolutely open and honest and truthful about it. And of course, we want to make connections and work towards healing, but in particular, the other pillar that pertains to this issue of protecting precious history is taking action, taking steps to dismantle systems of inequality, injustice, and oppression so that we can transform the nation. The connection to the Linked Descendants group is that we say we are people who research the hard truths of American history starting in our own families. We tell our own family stories. We talk about those hard truths among ourselves and we write about them so that other people will know as well. And we take responsibility for the ways those hard truths are affecting the United States today. So these are the commitments from Coming to the Table and from Linked Descendants that move us to be outraged and to be worried at the threats to the truth of U.S. history and lead us to look for ways to take action to defend those truths. What kind of dangers are we talking about? You see Trump's announcement, but what else? Well, we have actions on the part of federal and state governments. The danger, though, is broader than that. It comes from people in this country who fear and hate what they consider objectionable and dangerous topics for people to study, teach, or commemorate. In fact, among a portion of the American population, anything that might undermine or call into question the white supremacy vision of the United States. So anything that they shorthand label as DEI. Furthermore, it's important to remember that authoritarian regimes, which we are in the midst of experiencing, want to dominate historically marginalized groups and their allies. And they carry out their domination by cutting us off from our roots, cutting our connection to our deeply held values, and separating us from our long-standing traditions. That's an authoritarian strategy. So in this case, they're going after everything to do with African American history and culture first, but keep an eye out. This is going to extend to Hispanic, Indigenous, Asian American, and Pacific Islander heritage and history as well. And the actions to assert dominance will be taken by, or have already been taken by, government officials, and it's visible and it's publicized, but it will also be taken secretly, quietly. You won't know it's happening, and it will extend down to action by local groups and individual fanatics. This issue has been in the air, so to speak, well before the March headline from the White House. Back in February, a public historian friend of mine posted a question on Facebook. What can we do to protect our history, our sources, and our research? And that question really got my attention. And I thought, I want to know the answer to that question, but I don't know it myself. I could not answer that question. I could not have put a post in response on Facebook with a bunch of ideas. And then I thought, wait a minute. I've done all kinds of things related to public history. I know people. I know people who do know the answers because the answers are part of the work that they do all the time. So I made a list of folks and I sent these 3 questions around. Some of these people work in well-known public institutions. Some of them are individual researchers, but they were all folks who I was pretty sure, had the knowledge and could give me the answers I was looking for. My responses came mostly from African Americans and mostly from people working in the South. And to my great delight, 2 of my own linked descendants were very eager to get involved. They are father and son, both professionals who have worked or are now working with the National Archives. So thank you to Jay and Calvin. And they helped to create a framework to help me anticipate and organize everything else that I learned. So across all my sources, there were a few common points that came out. The first one is that protection of historic sources, documents, photos, data, objects is imperative. In fact, the National Archives fellows said it is one of the critical questions of the time. And everybody said, yeah, efforts to destroy or prevent access to history have been underway long before Trump attacked the Smithsonian. They are all convinced that these efforts will continue and will expand. They will come from federal and state governments, as well as local groups and individual fanatics. That the destruction we see will be worse than anything we might expect. And we need to prepare ourselves psychologically for the fact that there are very likely to be instances of dramatic destruction, including the possibility of physical harm to people. And the extent to which that's the case is going to depend on how badly the rule of law breaks down. So my respondents were not looking at a particularly bright picture. And we've seen acts of cultural destruction already. So these photos come from the Department of Defense website and the website for Arlington National Cemetery. So at one point, the photo of the tomb of Medgar Evers was taken down along with the text The tomb is still there, but the photo and the text were taken down. The Navajo code breakers and their story, I mean, never mind the fact they helped us win World War II, that was all taken down. This photograph of the Freedmen's Village that was on the site where the National Cemetery was created, removed, and the story gone, the history of what was there before the cemetery taken down. And on a page about athletes who served in the military, the photo and the story about Jackie Robinson were taken down. Widespread protest. You may remember. Lots of clamor about this, and it did all get restored. So, 2 points. Protest works. So do protest, but no guarantee that the same kind of erasure won't be tried again, maybe not in exactly this same place, but in other places. And cultural destruction may show up for us in a wide variety of ways. So this is by way of saying, if you start seeing these kinds of phenomena, you can just say to yourself, oh, right, I know what's going on. This is part of destroying and erasing history and culture. And then you can decide what you need to do in response to that. So imagine that you're at an historic site or a museum, and you discover that the electronic displays, the interpretive panels, the video kiosks, the signage are erased or defaced or turned off. Think about the national parks. All you have to do is take away a lot of staff, and suddenly some of that material isn't available because there's nobody to get it up and running. Records on websites in electronic repositories and storage may be damaged or removed or made inaccessible, sometimes through a denial of service kind of action. You just can't get there. You can't get on that website anymore. Historic documents themselves may be stolen, shredded, vandalized, burned. Storage media like hard drives and audio or video recordings can be demagnetized. And that, if you've ever done that to to a USB drive, you know it's really simple. Monuments, parks, grave markers, museum displays, artworks, artifacts can be either closed off, you can't get to see them anymore, or they're stolen, damaged, or destroyed. And buildings may be closed with their interiors or exteriors vandalized, damaged, or destroyed. And be aware, because I know my reaction is to think, well, why didn't the staff do something? Well, think about what's been happening in the Park Service and in government agencies. Dedicated professionals who would preserve whatever it is they're doing till the end of the day are intimidated into doing what they're told and not talking about it or not discussing it with the public. So, a little grace for the people that we may bump into that we at first blush think are responsible. My sources also came back to say that certain kinds of resources are at particular risk. So, anything related to African American history and culture to one extent or another, and then anything related to other marginalized cultures. Marginalized feels like such a terrible word, though they're not groups that are of no value to me, but um, Online collections are actually at greater risk than physical collections because it's really easy to get into a website, get into a database, and delete and deface. So hackers can do that work from afar. They won't be seen. It's much harder to identify them. And online storage services, this I got from everyone, and most of them said it at least 3 times. Online storage services are not secure. So Google Drive, iCloud, whatever other online storage service you might use, it's not secure. Now, that doesn't mean don't use it. It does mean if you use it, also back up your material um, on the earth, so to speak, um, on a USB drive, on an external hard drive, on your own computer. Just don't leave the only copy out in the cloud. And another kind of resource that is particularly vulnerable, this makes perfectly good sense the minute you think about it. Any place that's set up for researchers to have access to information, to documents, to photos, and that wants contributors to contribute, to enter information or upload documents, is particularly at risk. Universities, libraries, um, genealogy sites. And I've been working on this for since February. And last week, I got a little postcard asking me if I wanted to join the class action suit against 23andMe in response to the ethnically targeted data breach that took place there in 2023. Of course, I chuckled and said to myself, are they going to have, how 2023 is not exact, or 23andMe is not exactly in a position to respond very well to a suit, but it just brought back to my mind, yeah, these online databases where we expect to have access and we expect to upload and download are they're at risk. There are also risks for smaller and more local organizations, and those risks are in proportion to some of the characteristics of the particular institution. So it depends on how well known the institution is. So I thought immediately about the International Civil Rights Museum in Greensboro, which the museum is built around the Woolworth's drugstore counter, and where there was a sit-in, a very important sit-in. Um, the risk is also in proportion to how outspoken is the local institution. To what extent do they talk about and advocate for African American history and culture? And then maybe this is why I heard a lot from, or heard more from people in the South. The risk is also in proportion to how intense the local threat is. So in Greensboro, there's a small but active Klan presence. Every now and then they get out in their cars and put up their Confederate flags and drive around, just so we remember that they are there. Individual records, so mine and yours, are we face that kind of low level threat that anybody faces to some random hacker getting into our device and making mischief with whatever they find there. So whatever measures we take to keep our devices secure, keep taking them. Physical spaces like historic sites, statues, memorials, graveyards, also face this kind of constant low-level threat for several reasons. For one thing, they're out in the open and they're visible, and that's the point. They are intended to be visible. The places that care for them may have limited budgets for security. So I think about church graveyards. There may be absolutely no security provisions for a small graveyard next to a small African American church. The stewards of these locations also may be unprepared. So one person I contacted is a senior person at a historical society in the South. And I know that they have some irreplaceable records related to African American history, and they hadn't yet thought about whether they were vulnerable to attack or to having those records destroyed or stolen. I'm hoping very much that my outreach to that person raised their level of concern. Um, Also, these physical places are often remote, so historic sites, particularly, are often remote, and some of them are high profile. So, if an organization were to attack them and write their name all over the building or the monument, that would be very sensational for them, and they'd get a lot of press, which they like. And I think about here in Durham County, the historic Stagville, the one of the buildings suffered an arson attack at the hands of, we're pretty sure it was at the hands of a set of lost cause activists who live in that part of the county. So these risks they're not hypothetical. So some of this information may sound pretty dramatic, and as I've said before, may stir up various feelings. Please remember that the information and the emotions that go with it were told to me by experienced resources, people who've been working with one kind of public history source or another. And most of those folks are not only experts, but African Americans. And what they're concerned about goes right back to probably a genetic level memory of what has happened in the past. So I believe the fear, I believe the concern, and I understand that that's coming from real experiences. But after I calmed myself down from feeling a variety of feelings, including being pretty upset, I thought, okay, it's sort of a theme of this period in American history that we feel our feels and we find ways to take action in spite of them. So keeping grounded, keeping centered, keeping connected, being in community, those are all among our most fundamental resources for being able to feel whatever we feel and take action anyway. And furthermore, I think of taking this kind of action as its resistance. And for descendants of enslavers, for European Americans, this is a form of reparative action. If we can help preserve precious history, we are contributing to reparative action. So we can put whatever we're doing in a much larger context and again, keep ourselves held and centered and connected. And so now we'll get to more of the good news, heading back towards the light. If you're going to do a project to protect data or physical records or a physical place, funding and resources are critical. There's going to be labor, storage media, facilities, and equipment. So one way to help is to contribute towards towards funding and resources. Whether you help out a local group or a friend or a family member, or you get involved with community fundraising and community-based volunteer work. And we've heard about several projects, volunteer projects going on at the national level. And you'll see links to those projects in the chat. So they include the National Archives, the Freedmen's Bureau records. You can volunteer at the National Museum of African American History and Culture and really thumb your nose at at the president if that helps motivate you. And the International African American Museum in Charleston. So there are links to those various sites. And if you know of other projects that either do accept volunteer help or might be persuaded to accept volunteer help, please post that information in the chat, because the more ways people can help, the better. A second factor to consider is everything is vulnerable. So everything includes buildings, documents, furniture, storage devices, and it includes the people. So think about the National Park Service and all those people who whose lives have been turned upside down. Everything is vulnerable, and plans for protection need to at least think about everything. You might not be able to protect everything, but you need to think about everything, and then what you can't afford to protect, well, so what else? How do we get around that? And redundancy is desirable. Storage technology will change. The argument that went on between my two cousins from the archives, Calvin and Jay. Calvin's the older, and he said, storage technology is going to change. Don't bother. Don't use it. Just, it's too much trouble. It won't work. 3 years from now, you won't be able to access anything. And Jay, who is Calvin's son and younger, said, Dad, what are you proposing? That we handwrite copies of all the documents in the National Archives? I don't think so. We have to trust storage technology and then plan for it to change and plan to upgrade and plan to transfer information when the changes occur. We need to find volunteers. I've already mentioned that, but I'm going to say it again. Find volunteers, be a volunteer. There are lots of places to volunteer. Help family and friends. Volunteer at the library, the local archive. Maybe there's a little historic association in your town. Check with your local churches. Have they digitized and stored away safely their parish records? Or, yeah, and volunteer for these different organizations that are listed in the chat. The bottom line really is there is no place too big and no place too small to not need volunteers. Even if volunteering consists mainly of letting them know that you care and you support them. That may be all they can take in initially, and that's good. And finally, local digitization projects can grow unexpectedly. So take some time to think through what preservation and protection might really look like, and plan and prioritize and choose a starting point. Don't let yourself be overwhelmed by, oh my goodness, there's so much. Yes, there is so much. And there are some priorities, and everybody can choose a starting point, or a group can choose a starting point. Some of the people that I talked to had either used creative solutions themselves or knew of groups that had come up with creative ways to protect their data and their records and their artifacts. So Calvin and Jay from the National Archives said, think about digitizing records, get everything that's on paper digitized, but also take photographs, especially of the most important documents. And I thought Jay rolled his eyes mightily, but Calvin said, print out. If you've got stuff stored digitally, print out hard copy. You're going to have to find a big storage box to put it in. But if the only thing that survives an attack is your printed out hard copy, you've got someplace to start to restore what was lost. Another idea was to have storage sites in multiple locations. So for an individual, that might mean you've got your box with your storage medium in it. So maybe you have an external hard drive, and then you have that at home under the bed or behind the desk, and then see about having a second copy in a different building. Maybe you leave it at your work site. Or you have a storage box with a family member and another one with a fellow researcher, or even in a partner institution. So if you've been connected to a local historical society and the building has a nice dry basement, that could be a good place for people in the community to, a secondary backup place to store documents and artifacts. Historic Stagville has been partnering with a very large university library, and they look at that as their backup. So they have at the site visitor center, they have video, they have photographs, hard copy records, family trees online, displays, but there are electronic versions of all of that are stored at this very large and well endowed university library, so that if the worst were to happen to the visitor center, they could reconstruct a lot of what they've been using from the library's collection. And then a friend who's on this call today told me about one of her friends who has a collection of valuable and famous letters, which she keeps a copy at home with her, but she's given the originals to a very large, again, well-funded, well-protected public library. So that's been her protective measure, her backup. There's a historic site that I know well that has lots of volunteers and lots of researchers physically in and out of the site and electronically on and off the website. They have people doing archaeology, they have people doing document research, they have people doing land surveys, making maps, and they figured out pretty quickly that they needed to set up a pretty formal set of logging everything. So who's researching what, where, and when. And then if a particular person is digging in a particular archaeological site, What did they find, and how were all of those artifacts stored, and who stored them, and where did they go? And they admit that keeping the log and doing the check-in and check-out process can be a little cumbersome, but a year ago they had an electric fire in the archaeology office. And that catalog of what was where and really served them well. And so they were much more quickly than otherwise able to figure out what was safe, what was damaged but could be restored, and what had been completely destroyed. And so then they could focus their restoration efforts. And finally, I don't know if David Hamilton got on today, but our friends at WikiTree are all saying, put your stuff on WikiTree. It's a great big electronic site. You can scan your records, you can take photographs and put them in your profile or a profile that you built for someone else on WikiTree, and that serves as an enormous backup. So keep WikiTree is our friend, and keep them in mind. So a lot of possibilities, a lot of ways that individually and for institutions, we can protect precious history. So we're probably ready to take some action, right? You all ready to jump in there and do stuff? Well, I want to start off with some guidelines for European American volunteers. And I learned these guidelines through the generosity and patience of African American family members and friends, but also by making a fair number of mistakes myself. And the first guideline is we're going into one of these preservation backup projects. Really dial up your self-awareness. I mean, dial it to its highest setting, because if you're at all like me, you're going to start off with a big charge, a lot of energy. You're passionate about doing this work. You really want to make a difference. And you may feel very kind of can-do, self-confident. We got this. And that's great. But if you let it just run loose, you are at risk of steamrolling the project and the people you're helping. And it's sort of like having a very spirited horse. Take it out and race it, but use saddle and bridle to keep it under reasonable control. Make sure that the heirs of the history that you want to help protect are taking the lead, because it's their history and it's protection of data, records, and artifacts that pertain to them. So let the heirs take the lead and ask them what they want to do. What do they want to accomplish? How do they want to go about it? And that lesson I got to the max when I was doing an overnight on Daufuskie Island, which starting in the 1890s became a winter resort for wealthy Northerners. And there are lots of nice big houses. And then on parts of the island are these pockets of buildings built by the earlier community of emancipated African Americans. So we're doing a little tour around, and there's this charming little white church. And it had been rescued from the protective impulses of one of the winter visitors. This was a wealthy lady. She loved this little building. It was kind of leaning over, And it was very odd. It had these two little doors in the front instead of one main door at the center, which is the way she thought a church should be constructed. And she had designs and plans and a work crew lined up and funding in place. And fortunately, somebody caught her before any action happened. She was just going to completely redo this church, even though her ancestors had nothing to do with building it. And when they got hold of her and got her to slow down and calm down and listen, they explained to her that the reason there were two funny little doors is that inside the church, the main set of pews was in the center and ran down the center of the church to the altar. And then there were two aisles and two narrow sets of pews, and the doors were so you could get into the two side aisles. Apparently, that concept did not match her experience. It hadn't occurred to her. So the people that were touring us around were very proud of the fact that not only had they restored the church, but they had rescued it from a would-be benefactor. So don't be that person is the lesson I took. So you've asked the heirs of the history what they want to do. Then you have to listen. Listen to the answers, take instructions, and do what you've been asked to do. And then finally, since you might very well make a mistake, end up offending someone to one extent or another, just, yep, okay, it happened. Apologize, acknowledge, and then let go of it. Get over it and continue on with whatever the volunteer work that you're involved in. So that's to help get European American volunteers in the right frame of mind. And here is a framework, one framework, my framework, the framework that comes out of my head doesn't mean it is the framework. So you could go to work on a project and discover they have a completely different approach to it, and that's great. Go with their approach. But I've already talked about planning is important. Some people love planning, some people are a little looser on planning. Um, Prioritization is probably going to be critical at the very least to help you pick a place to start. And some ways to think about priorities are what's most precious, either financially, sentimentally, culturally, historically. Precious is precious. What would be most difficult to replace? So does this little historical society have a famous document or a critical diary? Um, that might take priority for protection. What has the most direct bearing on the research associated with the institution, or even for you as an individual or as a family? What's most fragile, so it needs to get protected soon before it degrades any further? Is there anything that you are holding or an institution, large or small, is holding that is attractive to harm? And not that this pertains to any one of us, but I think about the Constitution on display in the National Archives. And I go, wow, we're already dismantling it. Is that something that could become a target for destruction of some kind? Be sure to organize and catalog whatever is being preserved and protected. And do, if you can, consult expert resources. Maybe you have a document on, that's 200 or 300 years ago. And if you don't know how to take care of the paper and you can find an expert, that might be really worth doing. Archives, libraries, and museums are sources of information about, or it can be expert resources or can connect you to expert resources. And preservation, special preservation like that, is a place where funding may become critical to the project. Choose and get hold of your storage media and devices. Make sure that you have readers for everything that you've stored. I've been doing a lot of clearing out in my own house. Some of the stuff I'm clearing out comes from when I helped clear out my mother's house quite a while back, and it just went in boxes and it's sitting in my basement. And I have found tapes, good old tape recorder tapes. I don't own a tape recorder, so if that was meant to be important history, I'm sunk. I don't have a way of reading that. So something to keep in mind. Maybe you need storage bags or storage boxes, and you certainly need to decide on where you're going to store things. Sometimes where you can store things comes back and determines how you will do the storage. So the root cellar might require something a lot more damp proof than under the bed. Think about time factors and lead times. Some things that need to be preserved by expert help may have a longer lead time. And then get started or join in to something that's started, but keep track of the devices and where they're going, and be sure that at least two people know what's going on, whether that's at an individual level, so you know where you've put your the box with your external hard drive in it. Make sure someone else knows where you put it so that it doesn't get lost. At my best. And you that a lot of it consists of ordinary tasks that any of us can do, and some of them we can do from home. So this doesn't have to be, doesn't necessarily require vast expertise. Some of the work is actually repetitive and boring, but it's worth doing. But the point to me is that we have made such strides forward in uncovering and talking about the truths of American history. I think back to 2006 when the concept of linked descendants didn't exist. And coming to the table was just getting started. And my family didn't want to talk about slavery and enslavement, and it certainly didn't want to acknowledge that the descendants of the enslaved community were not only connected to us through slavery, but they were actually related to us through DNA. That was just so forbidden, could not talk about it. And I hear from other people that the same has been true in their families and in their communities. And I look at now, it's not a big deal anymore. There are people who have been publishing the family trees that shows the new pope's ancestry back to Haiti. And that's just in the news. And nobody's hair went on fire as a result. So we have really come a long way, and we cannot let that be lost. We cannot go backwards. We absolutely have to do what we can do to keep that progress, to preserve that progress. So, like my linked descendants, Jay and Calvin, I do believe that our history is precious and that protecting it from harm is one of the most important tasks we can undertake, whether we think of it as resistance or we see it as reparative action. It shores up our freedom and sustains unity in our families and communities and nation. And I'm really glad that we're on this path together, doing this work together. And catch my breath and we'll take questions.